No one noticed when Emily Rogers disappeared, not at first. In the early hours of April 27, 2022, there were no screams, no breaking glass, no 911 calls. The street outside her small duplex on West Becker Street in Milwaukee was quiet. Her car remained parked out front, untouched. Her phone lay inside the house, fully charged. The lights were off, but Emily was gone. It wasn't until the next day that someone raised the alarm. A close friend, who had grown concerned after unanswered texts and a missed playdate, walked up the porch steps and knocked. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. She peered through a window and saw what looked like a child's toy on the floor, undisturbed. Then she called the police. Dispatchers logged it as a welfare check. Not yet a missing person. A 23-year-old woman, mother to a 15-month-old daughter, hadn't been seen in over 24 hours. Officers responded within the hour. The entry was unlocked. Inside, the house looked lived in, not abandoned. A diaper bag by the couch, a half-empty bottle on the counter. Her phone sat face down beside the sink. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. Nothing overtly suggested foul play, but it also didn't make sense. There was no indication that Emily had packed or planned a departure. No suitcase, no missing clothes, no bus ticket stub. Her ID was in her wallet. Her social media had gone completely dark since the afternoon of April 26th. The infant, now temporarily with her grandparents, was unharmed but distressed. For investigators, one thing was already clear. A mother who disappears without her child rarely does so voluntarily. By April 28th, Milwaukee PD's Special Investigations Division had classified Emily as critically missing. A BOLA was issued to surrounding counties. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. Several neighbors reported nothing unusual. No loud arguments, no suspicious vehicles. A few mentioned hearing a baby crying through the night, but they assumed it was colic. Investigators pulled phone records. Her last known communication was a text sent at 6:14 p.m. on April 26th. The content was terse. "I'm here, let me know." The recipient, later confirmed to be a former partner, responded with a vague K. Nothing more after that. A digital forensics unit analyzed Emily's phone. Her location history stopped abruptly around 6:30 p.m. the same day. That aligned with her home address. No outgoing calls, no searches. The browser activity simply ended. It wasn't wiped or tampered with, just frozen in place. Police reviewed her recent life circumstances. Emily worked part-time at a retail store. She was co-parenting her daughter with an on-again, off-again ex-boyfriend. There were no pending custody disputes, no financial red flags. Her criminal record was clean. Friends described her as quiet, kind, and recently trying to rebuild. A detective sergeant made an offhand comment during one of the initial briefings. "It's too clean. People vanish, yes, but they don't vanish without noise unless someone silences them." At this stage, there was no suspect, no crime scene, just a house that felt abandoned without looking it. And one woman, 23 years old, 5 or 6, brown hair, blue eyes, missing from the fabric of an otherwise ordinary community. By April 30th, the FBI was informed, not because the case met federal jurisdiction yet, but because statistically the clock was ticking. After 72 hours, the odds of recovering a missing adult alive dropped drastically. The Bureau offered technical support, assistance with GPS triangulation, facial recognition from traffic cams, and social network scraping. But there were still no leads. Then came the first anomaly. A traffic camera on a feeder road in St. Francis, roughly 9 miles southeast of Milwaukee, captured a vehicle around 1:03 a.m. on April 27th. The car matched the general make and model of a friend of Emily's ex-boyfriend. The camera timestamp was clean, GPS data partially aligned, no traffic violation, no plates visible, just a car that didn't belong in an industrial zone at that hour. The forensic team made a note, cross-check vehicle activity with known associates. A request for satellite imagery was submitted. Still, no body, no blood, no witness, no confession, just a mother missing, and a data trail that flickered briefly before going dark. In the first 48 hours of any disappearance, investigators dig backward. The logic is simple. People don't vanish without context. So when Emily Rogers failed to reappear by April 29th, Detectives began the standard procedure, cross-referencing prior incidents, domestic calls, and civil filings connected to her name. What they found wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent. There were 3 police reports on record involving Emily and a man she had dated on and off for roughly 2 years. None had led to charges, none were recent, but all shared the same pattern: verbal disputes that escalated behind closed doors, followed by withdrawn statements and uncooperative follow-ups. The earliest dated back to 2020, when Emily was pregnant. In that report, the responding officer documented a complaint of pushing, choking, and verbal threats. The listed suspect denied the incident. Emily declined medical attention and requested that no charges be filed. By January 2021, another report was filed, this time from a neighbor. Screaming had been heard through the walls. The officer noted visible bruising on Emily's arm, but again, no arrest was made. She insisted it was an accident, that things were better now. A familiar cycle. It was clear that whatever tension existed in that relationship never completely dissipated. Detectives reviewed text exchanges extracted from Emily's phone. Some had been deleted, but recovery software pulled fragments. On April 20th, 6 days before she vanished, she had written to a friend, "If anything happens, tell them I didn't just walk off." That message stood out, not for its melodrama, but for its clarity. It was an intentional statement, and she'd only sent it once. It wasn't part of an ongoing conversation. It wasn't followed up. It simply hung there, without context, until investigators found it. The forensic techs also isolated voice memos on her device. One audio file, time-stamped April 12th, featured Emily speaking softly, "I'm trying to leave. I just want to make sure Redacted doesn't follow me." The file was never sent. It sat in her local storage, perhaps forgotten, perhaps hidden. By now, the detectives were reviewing a subject with a documented pattern of control. Restraining orders had been suggested to Emily in the past but never pursued. Friends confirmed she'd expressed fear of being watched, but no formal stalking report had been filed. These aren't legal dead ends, but they are soft trails, enough to indicate risk, not enough to convict. One former co-worker told officers during her interview, "She stopped wearing makeup, stopped going out. Everything became about keeping things calm." Investigators requested GPS data from the phones of multiple associates. They were building a behavioral map, location overlaps, tower pings, known addresses. The heat map centered consistently around 3 zones: Emily's home, her ex-partner's location, and an industrial zone near St. Francis. That pattern wasn't wide, it was compact, concerningly so. Meanwhile, victim services flagged Emily's case for high-risk domestic violence classification. That wasn't procedural. It was a designation used internally when a missing woman fit a specific profile. Recent attempts to leave a controlling partner, loss of contact, and sudden digital silence. The lead detective reviewed the full report stack late that night. His handwritten note added to the margin read, "The data aligns too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." The forensic team knew what came next. They didn't need a confession. They needed inconsistencies between where people said they were and where the records showed they had been. That meant cross-matching phone data, digital footprints, vehicle tracking, and behavioral history. But what Emily had left behind wasn't just technology. It was a sequence of red flags written across public records, minor calls, and missed opportunities. The kind of signs communities only recognize after it's too late. By May 1st, 5 days after Emily Rogers vanished, the investigative focus shifted toward closing the digital gaps in her final known hours. The goal was no longer just locating a missing person. It was reconciling what people claimed with what the data proved. The contradictions were not subtle. Cell tower records from Emily's phone placed her within a consistent radius around her home until roughly 6:31 p.m. on April 26th. After that, the signal stopped transmitting entirely. The phone never pinged another tower, and no one accessed her cloud accounts again. But investigators noticed something else. Her mobile service remained active until early May. The phone hadn't been turned off. It had been destroyed or removed from network range. Her ex-partner's phone, meanwhile, showed movement late into the night of April 26th and into the early hours of the 27th. That alone didn't prove anything, but when his stated whereabouts during interviews were mapped against cell site data, Discrepancies emerged. He had told officers he'd been home that night after work. The data indicated otherwise. Between 12:48 a.m. and 1:17 a.m., his phone connected with towers south of Milwaukee, specifically in St. Francis, near a lightly trafficked industrial corridor. To strengthen the timeline, detectives pulled automatic license plate reader (ALPR) data from roads surrounding that zone. One vehicle associated with a known associate of the ex-partner, a gray sedan registered under a third party, appeared briefly on South Pennsylvania Avenue at 1:06 a.m. Surveillance from a nearby scrap metal facility captured the same vehicle passing through the edge of its camera frame. Headlights dimmed. The footage was grainy. There was no confirmed image of who was driving. The forensic analysts flagged this point in the case file. Subject's claim of location between 6:45 p.m., April 26 and 2:00 a.m. April 27 contradicts digital data. No viable alibi. With probable cause forming around the timeline, law enforcement secured subpoenas for Google location history and app activity tied to all phones of interest. It's a standard investigative step, used not only to prove guilt, but to eliminate possible misreads. However, only one device, the ex-partner's, showed high-frequency GPS activity near the potential dump site. No other phones in his contact network intersected those coordinates during that window. A member of the tech team commented during briefing, "The pattern of movement isn't random. It stops, then repeats within a 2-block range. That's not commuting. That's staging." Parallel to this, forensic teams re-entered Emily's home for a secondary sweep. No blood spatter was found, no forced entry, but a partial shoe print, size 12, consistent with a common men's athletic brand, was recovered near the entry carpet, overlapping one of Emily's known prints. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been there during the initial check. They bagged it. Prints were sent for analysis, cross-checked against departmental records. Meanwhile, the detectives conducted targeted interviews. Friends confirmed Emily had planned to meet with her daughter's father the night she disappeared, though no one had heard from her after that point. Two individuals who had spent time with both parties in the past gave conflicting statements. One described the ex as controlling but not violent lately. The other, however, stated she had overheard him say, weeks earlier, "She's not going to keep the kid from me. I'll fix it." This statement was included in the affidavit as hearsay, but supported the need for closer scrutiny. Back at headquarters, investigators noted that the subject under informal suspicion had called off work on April 27th, the morning after Emily went missing. It was his first unplanned absence in over 3 months. When asked, he said he didn't sleep well and wasn't feeling great. The timing, coupled with location inconsistencies and digital silence from Emily, drew additional attention. Still, no arrest was made. The legal bar had not yet been crossed, but the picture forming was not of a random disappearance or voluntary flight. It was a timeline defined by silence, disconnection, and false narratives, one that pointed towards something deliberate. The location wasn't random. It was the kind of place most residents never had reason to visit. A narrow access road tucked behind a cluster of disused industrial lots on the far edge of St. Francis, Wisconsin. The ground was uneven, marked by patches of gravel, rusted scrap, and low brush that hadn't been cleared in years. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing. But to the detectives, it was the first place where the silence surrounding Emily Rogers might begin to fracture. On May 5, 2022, 9 days after Emily was last seen, Milwaukee PD, in coordination with forensic search units and cadaver dogs, executed a planned search of that stretch of industrial terrain. The decision had been based on triangulated mobile data, irregular vehicle activity logged by traffic cameras, and the behavioral patterns pulled from digital forensics. It wasn't a guess. It was a narrowed target built from 3 overlapping sources. Just after 9 a.m., one of the canines alerted near a patch of disturbed soil behind a chain-link fence. The ground was shallowly covered, recently turned. A black contractor-grade plastic bag was partially exposed beneath layers of leaves and broken wood. The area was immediately cordoned off. Evidence flags were placed. Scene photography began. No one touched the site until the full forensic team arrived. The recovery protocol followed standard procedure. Personnel wore full-body suits. The excavation was documented inch by inch. The bag, once fully unearthed, was sealed, tagged, and transported for processing under chain of custody supervision. A secondary scan of the site uncovered fragments of duct tape, an elastic hair tie, and a partial footprint, deeply pressed, consistent with a men's size 12. The remains inside the bag were positively identified through dental records. It was Emily Rogers. Autopsy results would take several more days, but early indicators were evident. Advanced decomposition consistent with outdoor exposure, ligature marks on the neck, no immediate signs of gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma. A preliminary coroner's note listed the likely cause of death as asphyxiation due to strangulation. Toxicology was pending. There was no wallet, no ID. The bag contained only the body and the residual artifacts that now served as physical testimony. The location choice itself held weight. It was remote enough to avoid attention, but accessible enough to be reached quickly. GPS logs showed that one phone of interest, the same device flagged for nighttime movement on April 26th, had been in that radius for 29 minutes. The time of the data entry coincided with a drop in all digital communication from Emily's device. That correlation was entered into the official investigative report as critical. Investigators also noted the absence of tire impressions. The site had been entered on foot, or else the vehicle had parked on paved ground before the final approach. A search of a nearby drainage ditch yielded a disposable glove and an empty water bottle, both bagged and tested for trace DNA. The results would take time, but the materials were consistent with ad hoc cleanup behavior. Back at headquarters, case managers updated the classification. Emily Rogers was no longer a missing person. This was now a homicide investigation. The detectives held a closed-door briefing that evening. The evidence was starting to speak for itself. What had begun as a digital cold spot was now a crime scene, with physical proof, behavioral inconsistency, and an emerging timeline that narrowed the list of possibilities. From that point forward, the case wouldn't be built on assumptions. It would be constructed on trace, fiber, sequence, and contradiction. Still, a deeper question lingered across the team. If this site was meant to hide her, why wasn't it better concealed? Why bury someone only partially in a location tied so directly to a suspect's movements? It wasn't a mistake made by someone with foresight. It was a disposal born out of panic. And panic always leaves fingerprints, just not always on surfaces. On May 6th, the day after Emily's remains were recovered, the tone of the investigation changed. It no longer centered on hope or speculation. It became about proof. Who knew what, when, and what they were willing to admit under pressure? The case file grew thicker, but the number of viable witnesses remained small. Among the most relevant were two men, Andre and Felix Torres. Both had long-standing ties to the person of interest and had previously been seen with him in surveillance footage near the industrial area in St. Francis. At first, they claimed to know nothing, but as digital evidence mounted and their own movements came under scrutiny, the story began to shift. Interview protocols were carefully structured. Detectives isolated the two brothers in separate rooms and conducted mirrored questioning based on timeline markers pulled from phone logs and plate reader data. Felix broke first. He admitted they had received a late-night call on April 26th, asking for a ride to fix something. He claimed they thought it was just a disagreement and didn't ask questions. When pressed on whether he saw Emily that night, Felix hesitated. He said she wasn't moving. He said she looked pale. He said he didn't want to get involved but didn't know how to say no. That moment shifted the case from circumstantial to cooperative. A statement was taken. It included critical details. The suspect was panicked, rambling about losing control, saying she just wouldn't stop yelling. He said he didn't mean to hurt her, but she had to learn not to threaten me with my kid. Felix described the bag, the gloves, the drive to the site. The shovel was already in the trunk. The story wasn't volunteered out of guilt. It came out of fear. Once Felix was shown his own phone's tower data from that night, he had no room to deny presence. But his willingness to guide detectives back to the site, confirming the disposal location, sealed his cooperation. Andre, questioned next, confirmed the same general events, but insisted he stayed in the car. He said he never saw the body, never touched anything, and thought they were dumping trash. His story lacked detail, and the lack of physical evidence connecting him to the bag itself left his involvement legally ambiguous. For now. This testimony alone wasn't enough to file charges against the central figure, but it was enough to re-interview him under a new lens. And it was enough to subpoena every text message, app log, and deleted file from his devices. It was also sufficient to authorize a forensic search of his residence. At his home, investigators collected a set of black contractor bags, a roll of duct tape with worn adhesive, and a shovel with fresh dirt residue. A vacuum filter from the living room was sealed for testing after trace material was observed. Luminol was applied in a hallway area. No blood was detected, but that didn't rule out the presence of biological evidence. Digital forensics recovered a deleted search dated April 27th at 3:14 a.m. How long before a body starts to smell? The entry was retrieved from cached Chrome browser logs. There was no attempt to wipe history. The timestamp aligned with the early hours immediately after Emily's disappearance. Despite all this, no formal confession followed, but the chain was tightening. Investigators now had a witness placing the suspect at the scene, physical materials in his possession matching items found at the recovery site, a digital search that implied post-event panic and concealment behavior. And still, what stood out most was not the presence of direct violence, but the absence of urgency to undo it. That's what troubled investigators most. Emily hadn't just been killed. She had been buried, left, and ignored. The silence afterward wasn't the result of shock. It was strategy, and strategy left a paper trail. On May 9th, the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office finalized the preliminary autopsy report. Emily Rogers had died from manual strangulation. The pressure applied to the neck left visible damage to the hyoid bone and larynx, consistent with forceful compression by hand. There were petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, abrasions on the chin and upper chest, and deep bruising to the throat, findings that ruled out accidental injury or suicide. Time of death was estimated between 6:30 and 10 p.m. on April 26th. Toxicology returned negative for narcotics, alcohol, or sedatives. No defensive wounds were found on her hands or forearms. That absence, to forensic pathologists, often pointed to a struggle being brief, or to the victim being caught off guard. She likely never had a chance to fight back. Fibers collected from the duct tape near the burial site matched adhesive residue recovered from the suspect's home. Lab technicians confirmed it was from the same manufacturing batch. While not unique on its own, this evidence became critical when tied to bag type, soil composition, and hair samples found on both the recovered tape and the living room carpet of the suspect's apartment. One hair, brown, root attached, was matched to Emily through mitochondrial DNA analysis. That, in combination with the physical bagging material and duct tape pattern, formed a three-point chain directly linking the disposal site to the residence. Forensics also reviewed the vacuum filter taken from the suspect's hallway. Inside were particulate fragments consistent with potting soil and decomposed plant matter, samples that matched the industrial plot in St. Francis. A match didn't prove action, but it suggested post-disposal cleanup within the home. Meanwhile, digital forensic analysts worked a parallel path. Chat logs recovered from the suspect's device revealed a deleted draft message dated April 27th at 1:52 a.m. Never sent. It read, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I panicked." It had been saved in the device's cache memory, retrieved via data extraction tools typically used in felony homicide cases. Detectives used this compiled forensic package to secure a full warrant, not just for the suspect's phone, but for his cloud backup, prior search history, and device pairing logs. What emerged was a string of Google Maps queries for remote locations within a 15-mile radius, time-stamped days before Emily went missing. Among the top results was the exact area where her body had been found. The chain of evidence didn't rest on one dramatic moment. It built incrementally, from tissue bruising and hair root analysis to deleted browser caches and particulate cross-transfer. In the world of forensic prosecution, it wasn't a single point of failure that unraveled a story. It was the accumulation of small, irrefutable truths, each one sourced, preserved, and timed. Detectives presented the full sequence in a sealed affidavit. The totality of findings met the prosecutorial standard for homicide with intent. No confession had been obtained, but one was no longer necessary. This was the point where emotion became background noise. The forensic records spoke louder than grief or speculation. But even then, behind every lab report and specimen tag was the reason this mattered. A woman disappeared. A daughter lost her mother. A community, once unsure, now knew what had been done and who had done it. On May 12th, Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office received a completed evidentiary packet from investigators. It included a detailed timeline, corroborated testimonial statements, confirmed forensic matches, and data extractions from multiple devices. The packet was not narrative, it was functional. Its only job was to meet the threshold required for a charge of first-degree intentional homicide. A judge reviewed the request for a no-knock arrest warrant the same afternoon. The affidavit was precise. Probable cause established by cellular tower triangulation, material evidence recovered from the suspect's home, a cooperating witness placing the suspect at the crime scene, and digital indicators of planning and concealment. The judge signed it without revision. At 6:14 a.m. on May 13th, tactical units from the Milwaukee Police Department executed the warrant. The suspect was taken into custody without incident. No weapons were recovered. He requested a lawyer immediately. No statement was given. From the outside, it looked like the final step. But for the prosecution, this was only the beginning. The first priority was the preservation and sequencing of the chain of custody. Every bag, glove, filter, fiber, and digital record needed to be accounted for with time-stamped logs. Any misstep could introduce reasonable doubt. Prosecutors reviewed every lab report for cross-contamination risk. The forensic teams double-checked chain of evidence records. Redundancy was deliberate. In homicide, the standard is not suggestion, it is certainty. Simultaneously, a grand jury was impaneled to formally indict. Witnesses were selected based on evidentiary relevance, the lead detective, the forensic analyst overseeing DNA testing, the digital forensic specialist, and Felix Torres. His testimony, while self-preserving, was instrumental. He had been offered limited immunity in exchange for full cooperation. That decision wasn't taken lightly, but without his cooperation, parts of the timeline would remain circumstantial. His presence at the site, his knowledge of the bag, and his confirmation of the suspect's behavior immediately following the incident all reinforced the prosecution's foundation. In court filings, the prosecution made clear that the motive, while not definitively established, centered on a custody conflict and prior history of coercive control. This wasn't a sudden escalation without precedent. It was the culmination of a volatile dynamic that had already been recorded in police reports, text messages, and warning statements made by the victim to friends. The defense requested a psychological evaluation of the accused, indicating they might pursue a diminished capacity argument. However, there was no medical history supporting a claim of mental impairment or instability. Furthermore, a recovered browser history from the suspect's phone, detailing legal penalties for homicide and body disposal, suggested a rational understanding of the criminal implications. Court scheduling moved quickly. A preliminary hearing was set for late May. In the interim, prosecution teams began preparing visual exhibits for court. Layered timelines, side-by-side cell tower maps, material match charts between duct tape batches, and witness testimony plotted against GPS metadata. The aim was simple: build a case so structurally sound that no single detail could be isolated and attacked without collapsing under its own contradiction. Throughout this phase, law enforcement also provided regular updates to Emily's family. It wasn't required, but it was intentional. They had remained involved since the beginning, attending briefings, reviewing recovered items, and confirming aspects of Emily's routine. It was her mother who identified the elastic hair tie found at the scene as something Emily wore nearly every day. That small detail helped contextualize the scene not just as a disposal, but as a site of finality. What emerged in these weeks wasn't just a case, it was the blueprint of a system working within its limits to find accountability. Not redemption, not closure, just facts, collected, reviewed, and presented under oath. From the public side, media coverage began shifting tone. The story was no longer just about the disappearance of a young mother. It was about the evidence that explained her final hours, and the legal system mobilized to make that evidence matter. The courtroom was seated before 9 a.m. on the first day of trial. The prosecution team entered with a strategy already finalized. Build the case layer by layer, from forensic anchor points to corroborated witness accounts, without leaning on theatrics. The defense, limited in its scope, rested its approach on casting doubt, not on the evidence itself, but on how it was interpreted. Opening statements were brief. The prosecution told the jury this was not a case of speculation, but one of documented sequence. A woman went missing, her body was recovered, and the facts between those two events left no room for ambiguity. The defense offered no alternative theory. There was no claim of accidental death, no confession, and no explanation for the defendant's movements or behavior. Their tactic was silence. The prosecution's first key witness was the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy. With precision, she explained the mechanics of Emily's death: manual strangulation, consistent force, no hesitation injuries, and no evidence of prolonged struggle. The medical indicators supported a sudden attack and rapid incapacitation. Her testimony was not emotional, it was structural. Next came the forensic analysts. They walked jurors through DNA match charts, adhesive batch codes, and trace element comparisons between recovered evidence and items found at the defendant's home. Rather than overwhelm, the team distilled complex lab results into clear correlations. Duct tape, trash bag, vacuum debris, all matched. Then came Felix Torres. His cooperation had been secured under limited immunity. On the stand, he was nervous but consistent. He admitted to helping transport what he believed to be a body, described the burial site, and confirmed the defendant's statements in the car. The prosecution didn't frame Felix as heroic. They framed him as someone caught between fear and hindsight, and someone whose involvement helped unlock the truth. The defendant declined to testify. By the end of the second week, the state had rested its case. The defense offered no significant rebuttal beyond questioning witness memory and lab integrity. The prosecution's response was simple. The data didn't rely on recollection. It relied on time-stamped digital records, physical evidence, and procedural documentation. No piece of the story stood alone. The strength of the case was in its convergence. Deliberations took less than a day. On June 1st, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse. The sentencing hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. When it came, the judge imposed the maximum sentence allowed under Wisconsin law: 45 years in prison, followed by 25 years of extended supervision. The defendant showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. There was no statement, no apology, just stillness. In the gallery, Emily's family sat quietly. They had chosen not to speak publicly during sentencing. In their statement, submitted to the court and later released, they wrote, "Justice does not undo what has been done, but it tells the truth, and that matters." Emily's daughter was placed in the custody of her maternal grandparents. She was too young to remember the events that led to her mother's death. But as prosecutors noted in private, the goal of this case was never just a conviction. It was about accountability for a life cut short and a child left behind. In the months that followed, domestic violence awareness efforts in Milwaukee quietly expanded. A nonprofit added Emily's name to its outreach campaign, focused on early intervention in controlling relationships. The message was not about tragedy, it was about pattern recognition and acting before it's too late. Cases like this don't end with a verdict. They end with choices made in future silence, with friends who speak up, with systems that listen sooner, with prosecutors who pursue cases even when there's no confession, only evidence, and with families who carry forward not because they find closure, but because they refuse to let the last thing said about their loved one be the silence they didn't deserve. Sometimes justice comes too late to save someone, but it can still speak for them. If you're watching this, maybe you've seen signs like the ones Emily tried to show: control, fear, isolation. Don't ignore them. Whether it's for yourself or someone you love, say something, do something. Your voice might be what breaks the silence. And now I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever known someone in a situation like this? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Or if this video didn't connect with you, tell me why. Your voice matters too. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made you stop and think, hit that subscribe button. This channel is for real stories, real people, and real change. Let's keep this conversation going together.